The night pressed down on the Phuoc Tuy jungle like a wet fist, heavy, humid, and suffocating. A layer of mist clung low over the ground, curling through roots and fallen bamboo like pale fingers searching for something to claim. Somewhere in the darkness, water dripped steadily from leaves the size of dinner plates, each drop echoing like the steady ticking of a clock counting down to disaster. For 6 American soldiers of a long-range reconnaissance patrol, LRRP time was exactly what they were running out of. Pinned down, almost out of ammunition, surrounded on 3 sides by North Vietnamese regulars who knew the terrain far better than they did. The men of the 101st Airborne were trapped in a pocket of jungle, barely the size of a basketball court. They'd been fighting, moving, and bleeding for nearly 18 hours. Now, crouched behind rotting logs and creeper vines, they could only listen as the ring of NVA troops tightened around them with slow, patient certainty. It began as a whisper, a shuffle of rubber sandals on damp earth, a murmur of voices Vietnamese, clipped, hushed, disciplined, branches creaking under careful hands, metal brushing against canvas. The sounds were close, too close. Staff Sergeant Michael Red Halprin, the LRRP team leader, pressed a muddy hand to the side of his helmet and listened. He didn't need night vision goggles to know what was happening. He could feel the enemy moving 30, maybe 40 of them closing in, step by deliberate step. The Americans had walked right into a supply column earlier that afternoon. They had escaped the initial contact, but not the pursuit. Now the jungle swallowed them whole, and the NVA were hunting by sound, by smell, by instinct. A young private from the team whispered, "Sarge, they're all around us. We're screwed, man. We are absolutely." Halprin shut him up with a raised hand. He clicked his radio, hoping for a clear frequency, but the monsoon clouds above twisted the signal. Only static hissed back at him. He tried again. Nothing. The battery was fading. The set was dying. Hope was thinning with it. A crack of a twig snapped sharply from the darkness. Maybe 20 yards away. Then another. 10 yards. Closing. Halprin pressed the transmit button a 3rd time, teeth clenched. "This is Lazarus 1. Any friendly units in range? We need immediate assistance. I say again, immediate." Static swallowed half the transmission. And then, miraculously, a faint voice crackled through, barely audible, almost drowned by the storm. "Lazarus 1. This is Dingo. 5. Repeat traffic." "Dingo 5. Halprin blinked. He didn't recognize the call sign. Not American, not Army, not Air Force. Australian. He leaned into the radio, lowering his voice as if the jungle itself might overhear him. "Dingo. 5. We are surrounded. 6 men. Ammo low. No movement possible. Requesting. Anything you can spare." There was a long silence. For a moment, Halprin thought the signal was lost. Then the Aussie voice returned calm, controlled, almost unsettlingly steady. "Copy, Lazarus 1. Hold position. Do not speak. Do not move. We're coming." "Coming? How?" No helicopters could get through this canopy. No artillery strike could be risked this close. Footmobiles would take hours. But Halprin didn't argue. He simply released the radio's push-to-talk switch and looked at the frightened faces around him, faces smeared with sweat, mud, and fear. "They heard us," he whispered. "Help's on the way." A corporal swallowed hard. "Who's they?" Halprin exhaled slowly. "Aussies." The men traded uncertain looks. "Australian SAS? Here? At night? In this weather?" Before anyone could question further, the jungle answered for them. Voices, dozens of them, echoed from the darkness. The NVA were closing in, their encirclement shrinking to just 80 meters, then 60, then 40. The LRRP team tightened their grips on their weapons. Their palms were slick with sweat and rainwater. Their hearts hammered heavy, rhythmic pulses against their ribs. They were already rehearsing the final firefight in their heads, the last stand that would light up the jungle and probably take them all with it. Then, above the crush of footsteps and whispers and rustling leaves, Halprin raised the radio one last time and whispered into the void. "If anyone's out there, we need ghosts." Unbeknownst to the Americans, less than 2 kilometers away, 5 Australian SAS operators were already moving. silent, invisible, leaving no tracks, making no sound. And unlike everyone else in the jungle tonight, they answered to the word, ghosts. The 5 Australians of Dingo 5 were already on the move before the last syllable of Halprin's call faded into static. They moved as a single shape, a low, drifting shadow across the forest floor, boots brushing silently through soaked leaves, bodies angled forward like hunters reading tracks only they could see. Corporal Ian Hawkeye Mallory took point. Lean but wiry, with a face carved by too many monsoon seasons, he held his SLR rifle tucked tight under his armpit, barrel never rising higher than his line of sight. Behind him, Sergeant Tom Riley, patrol commander, studied the ground with the precision of a surgeon examining an X-ray. Every snapped branch, every footprint, every disturbed fern told him a story. And the story tonight was simple. The Americans didn't have much time. 30 minutes earlier, the Australians had intercepted fragments of NVA radio chatter about a 6-man enemy scout team. The description, the location, the urgency, it all lined up. The Americans were being hunted, surrounded, stalked by a force that grew more confident with every passing minute. But confidence could be fatal in these woods. The Australians knew that better than anyone. Riley raised a clenched fist. The patrol froze instantly. Not slowed, not crouched. Froze. 5 grown men, each carrying 50 pounds of gear, became statues as rigid as jungle stumps. Even the night breeze seemed to pause when they stopped. Somewhere ahead, a branch cracked, subtle but distinct. Mallory listened, head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. 30 meters, he mouthed silently. Riley nodded. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly. This was freeze, the first half of a doctrine the SAS had perfected over 2 decades of jungle warfare. It wasn't simply stopping. It was erasing yourself. You didn't shift your weight. You didn't scratch your face. You didn't adjust your grip. You didn't even swallow unless absolutely necessary. Every muscle locked in place, as if the jungle's vines had grown up around your legs and arms. If a mosquito landed on your eyelid, you let it. If sweat burned your eyes, you let it. If an ant crawled down your shirt, you let it. Mouvement meant death. Mallory slowly mimed a hand signal, pointer finger forward, palm low. Enemy patrol ahead. The Australians waited 30 seconds. 60. 90. Time stretched thin like wire. Rainwater pooled under their boots. When the sounds of the enemy patrol faded, Riley gestured the next command. Fade. Fade wasn't retreat. It wasn't advancing either. It was something in between. A drifting withdrawal. A controlled disappearance into the jungle, like ink dissolving in water. They shifted their formation. Backpacks adjusted. Weapons angled low. Breathing slowed deliberately to match the rhythm of the rain hitting the foliage overhead. Fade demanded movement that was so slow, so methodical, that even if a spotlight flashed across them, the observer's brain would register nothing out of place. Humans detect movement first. Remove movement. Remove detection. In the SAS's own words, you don't slip past the enemy. You let the enemy slip past you. As they resumed their approach toward the stranded Americans, Riley replayed the radio call in his head. The voice on the other end, Halprin, contained the unmistakable tone of a man fighting the clock. We're surrounded. Ammo low. He'd heard that tone before. He knew what usually followed. But this time would be different. This time the enemy didn't know who was coming. Most Americans believed the SAS were simply another reconnaissance outfit, quiet, yes, but still infantry. They didn't understand what the unit actually was. A group trained to become invisible in an environment designed to kill anyone who didn't respect it. Riley signaled again. Mallory dropped to one knee and examined a set of overlapping footprints. Small, uniform, rubber-soled, NVA. Fresh. Maybe an hour old. The direction of travel led straight toward the coordinates Halprin had sent. Poor bastards, Mallory thought. The Americans were in the eye of the storm. The jungle suddenly pulsed with sound, branches shifting. A soft murmur of distant voices, the muted thump of boots stepping in mud. A large NVA element was repositioning, likely preparing for a sweep. Riley's hand rose. Freeze. The Australians vanished. Not literally, of course not, but to the eyes and ears of anyone passing within even 20 feet. they ceased to exist. They became vines, logs, shadows absorbed by the same jungle that hid their prey. For the next 5 minutes, a platoon-sized NVA patrol marched past them, whispering commands, weapons slung low, helmets bobbing between shafts of moonlight. None of them noticed the 5 shadows watching, studying, calculating. As the last soldier disappeared into the fog, Riley exhaled through his nose, barely audible. Time to move. Time to find the Americans before the NVA did. Time to show why the jungle feared silence. Tonight, freeze and fade wasn't just a tactic. It was a rescue mission. And a promise. For the Americans, the trouble hadn't started with gunfire. It had started with silence. The wrong kind of silence. 12 hours before their desperate radio call, the 6-man LRRP team from the 101st Airborne had been moving quietly along a narrow rise overlooking a valley choked with bamboo thickets. Their mission was simple by LRRP standards. Confirm reports of a new NVA supply route feeding forces deeper into Phuoc Tuy province. No contact, no firefights, eyes only. But the jungle had a way of turning simple into suicidal. Sergeant Halprin knew the moment they stepped into the valley that something felt off. Birds stopped calling. Cicadas paused mid-rhythm. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The team slowed. One of the corporals whispered, "Feels like someone pulled the plug on the whole damn forest." Halprin didn't answer. His eyes scanned the tree line, searching for anything, a movement, a shape, the shine of a rifle barrel angled just wrong. But the jungle stared back at him with 1,000 dark, empty windows. And then the smell hit them. Not smoke, not rot. Fish sauce. Halprin's gut tightened instantly. NVA. Fresh. Close. He raised a fist to halt the team, then crouched beside a set of footprints sinking into the mud. The edges were still crisp. Even in the humidity, that meant minutes, maybe less. He counted at least a dozen prints, maybe more. The private behind him leaned in. "Multi-prepare?" Halprin nodded. At least a squad. But it wasn't a squad. Not even close. The LRRP team moved east, shifting course toward higher ground, hoping to skirt whatever enemy patrol they'd nearly stumbled into. They advanced slowly, weaving between giant trees whose roots twisted like frozen serpents. Every step was deliberate, rolling heel to toe to avoid snapping twigs or crunching dried leaves. For a while, the forest stayed still. No voices, no footsteps, no signs of pursuit. But the calm was a lie. 2 hours later, their point man raised a clenched fist halt. He pointed down into a shallow ravine. Through a lattice of bamboo stalks, they saw them. NVA porters hauling rice bags and ammunition crates. 3, 4, no 15 of them. "Supply column," the corporal whispered. "Big one. Too big." Within seconds, it became clear this wasn't some wandering platoon. This was a major movement, a force far larger than any LRRP team was meant to observe up close. The column stretched far beyond what they could see through the foliage. Halprin's heartbeat thudded in his ears. Back out. Quiet. Slow. But fate didn't care about quiet or slow. An NVA soldier at the tail of the column broke off to take a piss behind a tree. He stepped out just far enough to see movement, maybe a boot, maybe a shadow, maybe nothing at all, but it was enough. The soldier froze. His eyes widened. His mouth opened. Crack. The point man's suppressed Car 15 spat a single round. The NVA soldier dropped silently into the brush. But silence was no longer their ally. Voices rose. Questions. Shouts. Commands. Dozens of heads turned. Then the jungle exploded. AK-47 fire ripped through the trees, bullets shredding bark, leaves, and dirt. The LRRP team scattered behind roots and stumps, returning controlled bursts to slow the advancing wave. But they weren't fighting a squad anymore. They were fighting a hornet nest they'd just kicked open. Within minutes, NVA troops flanked both sides, funneling the Americans toward a narrow pocket where thick undergrowth created a natural trap. Grenades thumped into the ground, sending clumps of mud and leaves into the air. The LRRP radio operator took shrapnel to the shoulder. A private caught a round that tore through his rucksack and grazed his ribs. Halpern grabbed the radio handset. "Thunderbird, this is Lazarus 1. Contact heavy. We need immediate extraction." Static. The storm overhead was swelling clouds, crackling with electricity, the humidity turning the air into a wall of water. Radio signals twisted, bent, died. "Try again," the corporal shouted. "I'm trying," the operator barked, blood running down his arm. But the NVA didn't wait. Every 20 minutes, more enemy troops arrived, organized, deliberate, tightening the noose from multiple angles. It wasn't pursuit anymore. It was a coordinated encirclement. By late afternoon, the Americans were boxed into a kill pocket barely big enough to lie down in. They were outnumbered at least 15-1. They were losing daylight. They were low on ammo. And the jungle normally a veil for LRRP teams had turned into a cage. That's when Halpern made the call he hoped he'd never have to make. He whispered into the radio, "This is Lazarus 1. If anyone can hear us, we need ghosts." He didn't know it yet, but the jungle had heard his prayer, and the ghosts were already on their way. The deeper the Australians pushed into the jungle, the more the night seemed to fold inward around them, dense, suffocating, almost alive. Monsoon clouds hung low like a sagging curtain, blotting out the moon and turning the canopy into a black ceiling, barely pierced by faint threads of reflected starlight. Every surface glistened with wetness. Tree trunks slick as oil, vines dripping, soil soft enough to swallow footsteps whole. It was the kind of darkness that devoured careless men. But the SAS were not careless men. Corporal Ian Hawkeye. Mallory paused at the base of a twisted banyan tree, raising a hand to stop the patrol. He lowered himself slowly, letting his fingertips skim the ground. Mud still warm, leaves disturbed. He brought 2 fingers to his nose and inhaled. Fish sauce, tobacco, sweat, NVA. Less than 10 minutes ahead. Sergeant Tom Riley crouched beside him, scanning the trail with sharp, analytical eyes. He didn't speak. He only tapped Mallory's shoulder once. They had to keep moving. The Americans would not last much longer. Behind them, Trooper Ben Skipper Rowland adjusted the weight of the radio pack on his shoulders and wiped rain from his eyebrows. Signals were spotty, but the last burst had confirmed the Americans were still alive. Barely. To their right, Trooper Declan Quinn slid silently into position, weapon angled diagonally downward, an old SAS trick to avoid any accidental noise from barrel contact with branches. Bringing up the rear was their medic, Lawson, a quiet giant who moved with surprising grace for a man built like a rugby prop. 5 shadows, advancing as if tied by invisible string. Riley signaled with 2 fingers. Half-pass, nous discipline tight. The Australians slowed further. Their movement was almost imperceptible, less walking, more gliding. The sound of their steps never rose above the ambient noise of water dripping from leaves. At times their silhouettes seemed to fuse with the trunks and vines around them, the way predators melt into the bush just before striking. For 20 minutes they advanced without a word, following the faint lift of terrain toward the last known American position. The jungle thickened. Sharp-edged elephant grass brushed their arms and legs. Thorny vines tugged at their sleeves. Mosquitoes buzzed in clouds around their faces, landing on skin, feeding freely. And still, not a single man slapped them away. Riley raised a fist, freeze. The jungle ahead rustled. Not the broad, clumsy rustle of deer, not the flutter of birds. These were human movements, low murmuring voices, boots sinking in mud, metal clinking softly, magazines slapping against webbing. Mallory leaned just enough to see through a lattice of vegetation. 3 NVA soldiers stood near a fallen log, scanning the darkness. One lit a cigarette, the brief flare casting an orange glow across his cheekbones. They were maybe 20 yards away, maybe less. The Australians remained motionless. Rain pattered lightly on their helmets. Sweat ran down their faces in thin streams. A mosquito settled on Riley's neck and bit deep. He did not flinch. The 3 NVA soldiers exchanged quiet words, stepped over the log, and moved downslope directly where the Americans were hiding. Riley's jaw tightened. They were running out of time. Once the enemy patrol disappeared into the undergrowth, Riley made a rapid hand signal. Advance, no noise, maximum fade. The team resumed, moving this time even slower, each footfall placed with surgical precision. Mallory angled them slightly north to hook around the NVA's projected path. The trick wasn't to outwalk the enemy. It was to outthink them. 10 minutes later, a soft pulse of static vibrated in Roland's headset. He crouched and whispered, "Lazarus 1. Faint signal. Low battery." Riley knelt beside him. "How far?" Roland tapped the side of the radio. 700 meters, maybe less." Riley nodded. They were close, but the jungle didn't give up its wounded easily. As they descended into a shallow saddle between two ridges, the canopy darkened even further, blocking what little light remained. The air turned thick, almost soupy. Every breath tasted like wet bark and mud. Somewhere ahead, a voice barked a command in Vietnamese. Then another, then two more. Echoing, coordinated. Riley's pulse slowed, not sped up. This wasn't good. This meant the NVA weren't just closing in on the Americans, they were tightening a multi-squad net around them. Mallory glanced back, raising 3 fingers. 3 elements. Estimated 30 to 40 men. Riley signed back. "We go through. We don't break contact. We stay invisible." 5 shadows eased forward. Between them and the Americans lay a cordon of enemy troops. But the Australians had a doctrine the NVA didn't understand. Freeze when the enemy was close. Fade when the jungle demanded it. Disappear when survival required it. And tonight, survival was non-negotiable. The ghosts kept moving. The ridge leveled out into a shallow basin where the jungle thickened into walls of tangled roots and chest-high ferns. Every branch seemed to droop low with the weight of the rain. Every shadow looked like it might move. The air tasted like mud, sweat, and the kind of fear men didn't talk about until years after the war, if they talked at all. Riley raised his hand and pointed 2 fingers toward a cluster of downed timber. Mallory nodded. That was it, the coordinates Lazarus 1 had sent. The Americans were close. The team slowed to an almost impossible crawl. Mallory moved first, picking his way through brush so dense it threatened to swallow him whole. Lawson, Quinn, and Roland followed, each man sliding silently into the earth like they were being lowered by wires. Then Mallory stopped. He lifted a single finger. He tapped the ground twice. Contact. Something moved in the brush 10 meters ahead, low, jittery, uneven. Mallory eased forward another inch, parting a frond with a gloved fingertip. A face stared back at him through the leaves. Wide eyes, mud-painted cheeks. American helmet band with a playing card tucked into it. A young soldier, maybe 20, maybe younger. Mallory didn't blink. He slowly brought one hand to his mouth. Silence, but the American's eyes suddenly widened, not in recognition, but in raw panic. He inhaled sharply, chest rising, lips parting. No, not now. Mallory shot forward like a striking snake. In a blur, he closed the final distance and clamped a hand over the young private's mouth, pinning his head against the earth. The kid thrashed for half a second, until Mallory's other hand tightened on his shoulder firm, steady, unmistakably human. The soldier froze. Mallory's voice slipped out in a whisper so controlled it barely disturbed the air. "Friendly, SAS. If you make one sound, they will hear us. Nod if you understand." The private nodded rapidly. Mallory eased his grip and guided the terrified American deeper into cover. The rest of the LRRP team emerged from the darkness muddy, exhausted, eyes sunken with fear and sleep deprivation. They stared at the 5 Australians as if salvation itself had just crawled out of the earth. Sergeant Halprin, crouched behind a rotting log, exhaled with relief that almost buckled his shoulders. "You have no idea how glad I am to see." Riley's hand snapped up instantly. "Freeze." Halprin understood the gesture, but the younger Americans didn't, not yet. One corporal opened his mouth to speak. Lawson was on him in a heartbeat, pressing a hand against his lips. Footsteps. Heavy. Multiple. The jungle vibrated with them. The LRRP team tensed, gripping their rifles, but the Australians didn't move, not a muscle. They sank into the mud, bodies flattening, hands pulling foliage over themselves with slow, practiced precision. The Americans watched in disbelief as the SAS seemed to dissolve into the earth. Only their eyes remained visible dark specks in the undergrowth. Halprin swallowed and mirrored them, pressing himself into the dirt. His men followed, some barely understanding what was happening, only sensing the urgency radiating from the Australians. The footsteps grew louder. Then voices. Vietnamese. Close. Too close. Mallory counted at least 8. Riley counted 10. Quinn counted 12. The numbers didn't matter. All that mattered was staying invisible. The NVA patrol entered the basin, moving slowly, rifles angled outward, searching the trees with clinical suspicion. Their boots squelched in the mud just yards from where the 2 units lay, fused with the jungle floor. One soldier paused only 3 meters away. He scanned the ferns, tilted his head, listened. The Americans held their breath, eyes burning, lungs begging for air. One private trembled uncontrollably from adrenaline and cold. Lawson, the medic, pressed a massive hand onto the kid's back, pinning him down gently but firmly absorbing the tremors with his own body to keep them from shaking the bushes. The NVA soldier wiped rain from his face, muttered something, then continued forward. Another 2 followed, their boots passing so close Halprin could see the mud caked around their soles. They lingered, longer than anyone wanted. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Every second felt like a lifetime. Finally, the patrol drifted east, swallowed by the trees. The Americans exhaled almost in unison, silent but shaky. Riley raised 2 fingers. Fade. He leaned close to Halprin, whispering so quietly it barely existed. We move. Now. No talking. Halprin nodded, his face still pale. Moments later, the Australians and Americans slid deeper into the jungle, one group seasoned ghosts of the bush, the other clinging to those ghosts like a lifeline. But the night was far from over. The NVA weren't done hunting, and freeze and fade was only beginning. The jungle closed behind them like a curtain, swallowing every trace of the NVA patrol that had nearly stepped on their heads. But Sergeant Tom Riley didn't relax, not even a little. His instincts, the instincts that had kept him alive through Malaya, Borneo, and now Vietnam, were screaming a single message. They're not done. At his signal, the Australians and Americans moved in a staggered column, weaving through roots and vines as silently as 6 wounded ghosts could manage. Rainwater streamed down their helmets and dripped from their elbows. The jungle smelled of wet bark, gunpowder, and the iron tang of blood the Americans tried to hide under their fatigues. After 50 meters, Riley halted and crouched low. Mallory moved up beside him. More of them, he mouthed silently. Riley nodded. He didn't need to hear the NVA to know they were coming. The jungle had shifted again. The vibrations through the ground, the faint tremor of branches, they weren't random. They were coordinated. Searching. Closing. He raised his hand and gave the one signal every SAS operator respected like gospel. Freeze. The Australians dropped instantly. The Americans hesitated, but only for a heartbeat before mimicry kicked in. Bodies pressed into mud. Faces disappeared behind ferns. Weapons angled down and tucked against the forearm to prevent metal-on-metal clicks. The only sound was the rain hissing through leaves. Then the jungle erupted. Boots. Many boots. Dozens. The enemy was everywhere, north, south, west. The NVA must have shifted to a full sweep, tightening their formation into a tightening spiral around the last known American position. Halprin's hand tightened around his Car-15. He leaned toward Riley, whispering. A firm grip clamped over his mouth. Riley's eyes burned into his. Absolute silence. Halprin nodded, breathing through his nose, heart hammering against the mud. Roland, carrying the radio, eased his shoulder pack deeper into the earth, letting rainwater soak the canvas to deaden the sound in case anything shifted inside. Quinn angled himself behind a fallen trunk, becoming nothing more than another lump of decayed wood. Lawson, the medic, slid his massive frame behind a tangle of vines, his outline vanishing as if pulled into foliage. The Americans tried to copy them, some successfully, some shakily. But one soldier, the youngest private, was trembling uncontrollably. Shock, cold, exhaustion, terror. Riley noticed instantly. So did the NVA. A flashlight beam flicked toward their sector, not directly at them, but close enough that every man felt the breath tighten in his throat. Lawson slowly, carefully, slid his body on top of the trembling private, pinning him down with his weight. The kid's vibrations traveled up through the medic's ribcage instead of into the earth. A human shock absorber, a silent shield, and not one sound escaped. The beam of light swept across the undergrowth. The NVA soldier muttered something too far to understand, but close enough to feel the intent behind it. Another voice answered. Then another. The tone carried tension. They suspected something. They didn't know what, but they knew this pocket didn't feel right. Halprin felt sweat sting his eyes. He didn't blink. Not now. The flashlight held on their direction for 3 seconds. 4, 5. Then it moved on. Footsteps approached. Slow, careful, listening. A pair of NVA soldiers stepped so close, Halprin could smell stale rice and tobacco on their uniforms. One knelt and pushed aside a clump of grass. Another jabbed at a bush with his rifle barrel. They were methodical. They were patient. They were centimeters from discovering 18 men lying helpless in the mud. Riley's breathing slowed to a crawl. His pulse softened until it felt more like a distant drum than a heartbeat. He became a stone in the jungle floor. Immovable, unreadable. He glanced at Mallory. Mallory blinked once slow. The signal for, "We're still good." Hold. But it wasn't the SAS he was worried about. It was the Americans. The corporal closest to Halprin gagged silently as rainwater pooled near his mouth. He fought the urge to cough. His shoulders twitched. Riley saw it happen, saw the impulse spike, saw the corporal's throat tighten. Without a sound, Riley slid 2 fingers into the mud, scooped up a handful of wet dirt, and pressed it into the man's lips. The corporal tasted grit, choked down mud, and regained control. Seconds crawled by like wounded animals. The NVA lingered, searching, sniffing, listening. A twig snapped under one soldier's boot far louder to the hidden men than it actually was. Then something miraculous happened. A radio crackled from the NVA's left flank, urgent, sharp. Orders barked. Response shouted back. The 2 soldiers withdrew, turning toward the noise. The sweep shifted direction. The spiral widened, and the basin emptied of voices. The Australians remained frozen for 30 more seconds, discipline honed to near inhuman levels before Riley finally eased his hand upward. Fade. They would not survive another sweep like that. They had to move, and now the ghosts had 6 more souls to carry through the dark. They didn't move for the first 5 seconds. Freeze required that. But fade. Fade demanded something far more difficult. Movement without being noticed. Movement slower than thought. Movement that dissolved into the jungle. Riley gave the signal 2 fingers, half-curved, downward, drifting. Fade. Mallory slipped forward first. Not fast, not even slow. Something in between, like mist sliding over moss. His feet found only the softest patches of earth. His hips moved independently from his shoulders to minimize silhouette. His rifle stayed angled downward along his thigh, invisible from frontal view. The Americans stared. People didn't move like this. Animals didn't even move like this. But the Australians did. Riley rose next, lifting his weight in increments so small that the mud barely knew it had been released. He motioned Halprin to follow at his heels. The LRRP leader obeyed, mimicking as best he could, shoulders tight, breath controlled, each step deliberate. Behind him, the rest of the Americans mirrored the Australians, though clumsily at first. Footfalls landed too hard. Equipment shifted. Nervous breathing rasped too loudly. But the SAS corrected them without a sound. Quinn tapped the bottom of a private's magazine, tighten it. Lawson pulled a radio antenna down to keep it from catching vines. Mallory pointed at a boot heel, then made a slicing gesture step flatter. Within 30 seconds, the 6 Americans were moving quieter than they'd ever moved in their lives. Not as ghosts, no, but as students following masters. The jungle around them wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive with danger. Voices shouted commands in Vietnamese. Branches snapped in multiple directions. A whistle shrieked from somewhere deep in the trees in order to pivot the sweep line. And then more footsteps, dozens of them, hammering through wet underbrush. Their nets collapsing inward, Halprin whispered under his breath. Riley's head snapped toward him, eyes sharp. Halpern froze. Forgot. No talking. The Australians didn't need whispered updates. They read the jungle like a map. The NVA were shifting, their search pattern contracting like a tightening noose. The only way out was to slip between the coils quietly, invisibly, before the sweep found them again. Riley angled the formation southwest, moving into an area of deeper terrain where vines grew thick and looping like ropes. Perfect cover if used properly. Death trap if not. Mallory reached a patch of elephant grass and stopped. He extended an open palm backward. Wait. He knelt, studied, listened. 2 NVA soldiers were moving parallel to them, close, but not too close. The Australians moved only when the men were mid-step, turning their backs, voices raised slightly as they argued about something Halpern couldn't hear. That's Fade's secret, Quinn would later explain. You don't avoid sound. You hid inside it. When the enemy stepped, they stepped. When the enemy spoke, they breathed. When the enemy paused, they turned to stone again. The formation weaved through the vines, dipping into shadows and reappearing only in slivers of darkness. 3 times they halted as NVA soldiers passed within 20 meters. Twice they rerouted when they sensed movement ahead. Once, they froze for an entire minute while a patrol fanned out, sweeping flashlights across the trunks. Late into the maneuver, the Americans began to understand something profound. The SAS weren't just good at hiding. They weren't just disciplined. They understood the psychology of the jungle. When a twig cracked under Quinn's boot barely audible, the Australians didn't panic. They didn't rush. They didn't look around nervously. Riley simply raised one finger. Pause. Let the jungle settle. Let the NVA decide they imagined it. After 5 seconds, the danger evaporated. Fade resumed. Step. Pause. Slide. Pause. Breathe in sync with the rain hitting leaves overhead. To Halpern, it felt like drifting through another dimension, like the Australians were bending space around them, drawing a line through the enemy cordon no one else could see. They advanced 80 meters, then 120, then nearly 200. Finally, Mallory stopped beside a massive fallen ironwood tree split open by lightning. He pointed to a gap underneath the trunk, a natural choke point between 2 ridges. This was it, the seam in the NVA net. They waited, listened. Left flank, footsteps retreating. Right flank, voices drifting away. Center, clear for 3, maybe 4 seconds at a time. Riley dropped into a crouch and turned to Halpern, whispering the only words he'd spoken in nearly 2 hours. Through here. Don't stop. Don't look back. Then he signaled the entire group forward. The Australians slipped through first. Then the Americans. One after another, all 12 men passed the seam, and the jungle swallowed their tracks as if they had never been there. Behind them, the NVA sweep closed the final gap, searching in all the wrong places. Fada had worked, but they were far from safe. Ahead lay open forest, steep terrain, and the final push to extraction. And the ghosts were running out of night. They cleared the seam by inches, 1 heartbeat ahead of the enemy sweep line. But survival in the jungle was never as simple as slipping past one trap. The NVA were persistent hunters, and they weren't just sweeping blindly anymore. Someone back there had found something. A broken leaf, a shifted footprint, a smear of mud on a route where no one should have stepped. Whatever it was, the NVA no longer searched like a net. They hunted like a spear. Riley felt it before he heard it. A prickle, a pressure shift in the air, a subtle vibration through the sole of his boot. Mallory stopped, eyes narrowing. He raised 2 fingers. Movement, then tapped his ear. Multiple. Halpern and his weary LRRP team tensed. How many is multiple? One private mouthed silently. Quinn held up 7 fingers. Then one more. 8. 8 NVA. Fast. Closing. Fade wouldn't save them now. Not with wounded Americans slowing the pace and tracking blood. Not with the patrol converging from behind. Riley scanned the terrain in a single sweep. To the west, dense bamboo too noisy. To the east, steep gully too exposed. Straight ahead, a tangled ridge good for hiding, bad for maneuvering. But north? North was perfect. A narrow choke point where 2 fallen trees formed a funnel, forcing any pursuer to enter in single file. Riley tapped Mallory's shoulder twice. Snap ambush. Mallory nodded once sharp, controlled. The SAS operators assumed positions with the fluidity of men who had rehearsed this scenario 1,000 times. It wasn't a full ambush. It wasn't a firefight. It was a surgical strike, designed to break pursuit and then vanish before the enemy knew what had happened. Riley pointed to Halpern and his team. Down. Hide. Don't fire unless fired upon. The Americans slid behind the trees and into hollows created by tangled roots. They steadied their breathing, checked magazines, swallowed their fear. Quinn positioned himself behind a rotted stump, bore trained on the narrow opening. Mallory settled into a shallow trench that smelled of wet roots. Lawson crouched low beside Halpern, shielding the young private again. Roland knelt with one knee in the mud, radio antenna tucked tight against his pack. Riley himself lay prone behind a curtain of vines, SLR already raised. No one spoke. No one needed to. The jungle did the talking. Footsteps closed in light but fast. Boots hitting wet leaves. Mumbled Vietnamese. The clatter of gear. A cough. Then the clicking of a rifle safety being disengaged. Halpern felt sweat bead down his spine. He mouthed, "Jesus." Mallory raised his hand, fist clenched tight. "Wait." The lead NVA soldier emerged first, barely a silhouette in the moonless dark, his outline defined only when lightning flickered deep inside the storm clouds overhead. He moved carefully, muzzle up, scanning side to side. A second soldier stepped behind him, then a third. 4, 5. Quinn's trigger finger tightened faintly, but he didn't fire. Not yet. Not until Riley gave the signal. The sixth soldier entered the funnel, turning slightly as if sensing something was wrong. His head tilted, his rifle lifted. Mallory exhaled, silent, controlled. Then Riley's fist opened. "Go." The jungle exploded. Mallory's SLR cracked once clean, sharp, decisive. The point man collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut. Quinn fired 2 quick shots, dropping the second soldier before he could scream. Riley's rifle barked twice more. Roland added a single shot that punched through the chest of the NVA radio man before he could key his handset. It lasted less than 12 seconds. 12 seconds of violence so precise, so sudden, that the Americans barely understood what had happened until it was over. The remaining 2 NVA dove for cover, firing blind bursts into the dark. Bullets snapped over the Americans' heads, slapping bark and kicking mud into the air. Riley didn't wait. He pointed at Mallory left flank. Quinn right. Mallory slipped to the left like smoke, disappearing behind a tangle of vines. Quinn vanished into the roots of a fallen fig tree. A single suppressed pop cracked from Quinn's position. 1 NVA fell. 2 seconds later, Mallory's rifle uttered a muted cough. The final soldier dropped without so much as a groan. Silence returned as quickly as violence had arrived. The Americans looked around, stunned, eyes wide, chests heaving. One corporal whispered, "What the hell was that?" Riley answered quietly, almost gently, "A snap ambush. You break the chase, then you disappear." Mallory was already wiping mud onto the fallen NVA's boots to blur the direction of travel. Quinn dragged a branch across the ground to erase footprints. Lawson checked the wounded American, then nodded he'd hold. Riley leaned close to Halpern. "We've got minutes, maybe less," he said. "They'll hear the shots eventually. We move." Then he raised his hand. Fade. And just like that, the ghost slipped back into the jungle, 12 men moving as one, swallowed by the darkness. Ahead lay the final push to extraction. And behind them, the NVA were waking up. The night wasn't over. Not yet. Dingo 5 didn't celebrate the snap ambush. There was no time, no breath, no space for anything except movement. Riley pushed the combined patrol deeper into the jungle, guiding them with hand signals so sharp and precise they cut through the darkness like a blade. The Australians were still silent. The Americans followed, not quite silent, but quieter than they had been at any point in their lives. Behind them, somewhere in the black ocean of trees, a distant shout broke out, sharp, frantic, angry. Then another, then a whistle. The ghost strike had been discovered. Halpern whispered, "They're on to us." Riley grabbed his arm and shook his head. No noisy. No wasted breath. Move. The terrain changed beneath their boots, sloping upward into a series of steep ridges. Loose stones shifted underfoot, threatening to roll and clatter down the hillside. The SAS adjusted instantly, knees bent, boots angled, weight kept low, sliding upward rather than stepping. The Americans tried their best, but exhaustion was dragging them into mistakes. Halprin saw it in their eyes. 3 days of movement. 1 day of fighting. 1 night of terror. Their bodies were giving out, but their will hadn't. Not yet. Up ahead, Roland tapped his radio twice urgent. Riley jogged to him, keeping low. Roland whispered, "Dingo, 5 to Falcon 1. Ready for extract. Coordinates marked." Static hissed. Then a voice answered through the storm. "Falcon, 1 copy. But canopy's too thick for landing. You'll need to reach the break in the ridgeline. Extraction only possible from open crown. Be there in 20 minutes." Riley looked at Mallory, who only gave a tight nod. They'd make 20, or they'd die trying. Quinn moved to Halprin and whispered, "Your men stay in the middle. If anyone falls behind, we carry." Halprin nodded once. They pushed harder. Rain slashed sideways across their faces as thunder rumbled above the canopy. Deep, distant, but closing. Dawn was coming, but the storm would delay the light. A blessing. A curse. Hard to tell which. Then the sound came. The unmistakable, stomach-tightening crack of a rifle shot. Not close, but not far either. The NVA were firing into the trees, probing the dark, testing for movement. A moment later, 2 more shots echoed, then the staccato roar of an RPD light machine gun. "They're flushing us," one of the Americans hissed. Riley's fist shot up. "Freeze." The entire formation dropped to 1 knee, or straight to the mud, turning into lumps of shadow. They waited until the echoes faded and the gunfire redirected elsewhere. Then Riley waved them on. When they reached the ridge crest, the storm broke loose in full. Sheets of rain hammered the forest, drumming on helmets and rocks. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, but sound softened with it. Their advantage. Mallory crested the ridge first, scanned the slope below, then signaled, "Down." The path to extraction lay ahead, a narrow deer trail plunging toward a stand of tall trees where the canopy opened at a natural break just wide enough for a helicopter to lower a rope. But they weren't alone. From the left, the faint glow of flashlights bobbed among the trees. From the right, silhouettes moved between trunks, silent, methodical. The NVA were trying to box them in again. Riley hissed, "Move. Now." They broke into a controlled descent, half-run, half-glide feet, finding softer soil, avoiding stones, weaving between roots with the instincts of men who'd done this too many times to count. The Americans struggled. Twice men slipped. Twice the Australians caught them before they fell. Halprin's wounded private staggered as his leg buckled. Lawson threw the kid's arm around his neck and carried him without breaking pace. The kid didn't protest. He'd passed the point where pride mattered. Then a flare burst overhead, green and blinding against the storm clouds. The jungle lit up. Shadows sharpened. Silhouettes formed. A burst of AK fire ripped through the trees. "Contact rear," Halprin shouted. "Keep moving," Riley barked. Quinn spun, raised his suppressed rifle, and fired 3 shots down the slope, not to kill, but to make the NVA hit the dirt and buy seconds. Seconds were life. Mallory skidded into the extraction zone, a muddy clearing barely 20 yards wide. Overhead, the storm clouds shifted, revealing a hole in the canopy. Roland keyed his radio. "Falcon 1. We're on site. Marking." He popped a pencil flare. A thin red streak shot upward, bright against the rain. Moments later, the thunderous chop of rotor blades approached, distant at first, then growing into a hammering roar that vibrated the treetops. The UH-1 Huey burst through the opening, angled aggressively, nose tilted. Rain sliced beneath its skids as the crew chief dropped ropes. "Go, go, go." The Americans scrambled for the lines. Halprin lifted his men in pairs, shoving them onto the ropes, securing harnesses with numb fingers. Quinn fired short, bursts into the tree line as green tracers snapped past them. Mallory dragged another American into position. Riley looked back. Shadows moved. NVA closing fast. Roland, up. The signaler hooked onto the rope and began to climb. Mallory followed, then Quinn, then Lawson with the wounded private hanging onto him like a drowning man. Halprin grabbed the last rope. Riley, come on. Riley aimed one last burst into the dark, buying the final 2 seconds he needed. Then he leapt, seized the rope, and locked his boots around it. The Huey lifted, rotors chewing the air, skids rising through the branches as bullets snapped past the cabin. The clearing vanished beneath them. The NVA erupted upward, firing in rage and frustration, and 12 men, 6 Americans and 6 Australians, rose into the storm, battered, bruised, soaked, but alive. The jungle fell away beneath them. The hunt was over. The ghosts had gotten them out. The Huey didn't fly straight back to base. It punched through the storm, veered south, then swung into a long looping arc to shake any possible NVA eyes, still tracking them from the canopy below. Rain smacked the fuselage like handfuls of thrown gravel. The cabin stank of sweat, cordite, mud, and adrenaline bleeding out of exhausted men. Halprin sat slumped against the bulkhead, chest heaving, his helmet tilted back just enough to expose a face smeared with rain and jungle grime. Across from him, Sergeant Tom Riley wiped mud from his cheek with the back of his glove. He wasn't smiling. SAS sergeants rarely smiled in the field, but the stormlight flashing across his eyes showed relief. Real relief. Hard-earned. Reluctant to show, impossible to hide. The young American private, still trembling from shock, cold, and the weight of everything that had almost killed him, caught Riley's gaze. For a moment he tried to speak. Riley raised a hand gently. "Don't," he said. "Save your breath." The rotor wash thundered so loudly, the kid barely heard him. But he understood. Saving them had required silence. Silence was still part of the mission. Lawson, the SAS medic, tightened a field dressing around the private's ribs, then gave him a steadying pat on the shoulder, heavy, reassuring, an anchor pulling him back to the world of the living. Halprin leaned toward Riley, voice hoarse. "I don't know how the hell you got through that. There had to be 40, maybe 50 of them." Riley shrugged. "We didn't go through them." He pointed 2 fingers to the left, went beside them, then 2 fingers to the right. Behind them, Mallory smirked. "They're good hunters. But tonight they were looking for the wrong prey." Halprin shook his head in disbelief. "You saved my team. You saved all of us." Riley didn't respond immediately. He looked out the open cargo door, watching the jungle blur beneath the Huey dark green waves flickering under lightning strikes. The storm felt like a living thing, shaking anger from its bones with every rumble. Finally he said, "You called." We answered. That's all. But Halprin could tell there was more behind the words, something heavier, older. The Australians had been in Vietnam a long time. They'd learned the jungle's rules by bleeding for them. They didn't talk about it. They didn't brag. They just did what needed doing. The Huey slammed through another gust and dipped hard to starboard. The crew chief yelled over the noise. 2 minutes out. The men braced themselves. As the helicopter descended toward the landing zone, the storm thinned just enough to reveal the faint glow of perimeter lights through curtains of rain. The outline of tents, sandbags, and concertina wire came into view. A cluster of medics waited near the helipad, ponchos whipping like flags. The Huey touched down hard. Skids hit mud. Engine roared. The world shook. When Halprin stepped off, he paused at the door and faced Riley. Riley nodded. "Same to you." They shook hands, no salute, no ceremony, just the grip of 2 men who had seen death walk between the trees and survived anyway. As the Americans moved off, Mallory came up beside Riley. Riley gave a rare, small smile. "We were overdue for a walk." Quinn chuckled. "That wasn't a walk. That was dancing through a minefield," Roland added. "With a radio that hated us," Lawson grunted. "With kids who nearly coughed us to death." The humor was quiet, understated, but real. The kind men earned through terror survived. When their gear was checked and their weapons cleared, Riley finally exhaled fully for the first time in hours. Ghosts, shadows, men who could walk between raindrops. But the name that stuck the one whispered in respect and disbelief came from the kid who'd trembled under Lawson's arm, thinking he was minutes from death. He said, "They didn't rescue us. They possessed the jungle." And in Vietnam, that was the highest praise any soldier could give.